They had no idea. The quiet kid was a kendo master. Now they're paying the price. Marcus Yamamoto had always been the invisible type. At 17, he stood barely 5'6" with a slight frame that made him look more like 14 than his actual age. His thick-rimmed glasses constantly slipped down his nose, and his messy black hair seemed to have a mind of its own, no matter how much he tried to tame it. When his family moved from California to Riverside High School in Texas, Marcus hoped for a fresh start, but within his first week, he realized some things never changed. The cafeteria at Riverside High buzzed with the usual afternoon chaos. Students clustered around tables according to their unspoken social hierarchies, and Marcus sat alone at the far corner, methodically eating his lunch while reading a worn paperback novel. He preferred the solitude, finding peace in the fictional worlds that felt far more welcoming than his current reality. Well, what do we have here? The voice belonged to Derek Castellanos, a hulking senior who stood 6'2" with broad shoulders and arms that looked like tree trunks. His buzz cut and permanent scowl made him look older than 18, and his reputation as the school's most feared bully preceded him wherever he went. Behind him stood his two faithful companions, Tommy Rodriguez, a wiry kid with dead eyes and a cruel smile, and Jake Morrison, whose baby face belied his vicious nature. Marcus looked up from his book, his stomach immediately knotting. He'd managed to avoid these three for almost 2 weeks, but his luck had apparently run out. The cafeteria seemed to grow quieter around them, other students instinctively sensing trouble brewing. "You're that new kid, right? The one who thinks he's too good to talk to anyone?" Derek's voice carried across the nearby tables, drawing attention from curious onlookers who were always eager for entertainment at someone else's expense. "I'm just trying to eat my lunch," Marcus replied quietly, closing his book and hoping they'd lose interest and move on. Years of dealing with bullies had taught him that sometimes silence was the best defense, even though every fiber of his being wanted to stand up and face them head-on. Tommy snickered and nudged Jake. "Did you hear that? He's just trying to eat his lunch," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice that bore no resemblance to Marcus's actual tone. "What's wrong with your voice, kid? You sound like a little girl." The insult stung, but Marcus kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged bullies to press harder. What these three didn't know, what nobody at this school knew, was that Marcus had been training in kendo since he was 7 years old. His father, a third-generation Japanese-American, had insisted on maintaining their cultural traditions despite living in America. For 10 years, Marcus had studied under Master Takeshi, learning not just the physical techniques, but the mental discipline that came with the way of the sword. But Master Takeshi had also taught him restraint. "True strength," the old man had often said, "lies not in the ability to strike, but in knowing when not to strike." Marcus had promised his father before moving to Texas that he would avoid fighting unless absolutely necessary. His previous school had nearly expelled him after an incident where he'd defended himself against 3 bullies, leaving all 3 hospitalized. The move to Texas was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to blend in and finish high school without incident. Derek leaned down, placing his massive hands on Marcus's table. "I'm talking to you, Four Eyes. Don't you know it's rude to ignore people when they're being friendly?" "I'm sorry," Marcus said, gathering his things. "I was just leaving anyway." But as he stood to go, Jake stuck out his foot, sending Marcus stumbling forward. His lunch tray clattered to the floor, spaghetti sauce splattering across the linoleum and onto his clean white sneakers. The cafeteria erupted in laughter, and Marcus felt his face burn with humiliation. "Oops," Jake said with mock innocence. "Clumsy me." Marcus knelt to clean up the mess, his hands shaking slightly with suppressed anger. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, some amused, others sympathetic, but unwilling to intervene. The custodial staff was nowhere to be seen, and the lunch monitors seemed conveniently distracted by other matters. "Look at him," Tommy whispered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Cleaning up like a good little servant. Maybe we should get him a maid's outfit." The comment drew more laughter, and Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. This was exactly what had happened at his old school, the same pattern of escalating harassment that had eventually forced him to act. He finished cleaning up the mess and walked away without a word, leaving the three bullies behind to celebrate their victory. The harassment continued over the following days. In the hallways between classes, Derek and his crew would shoulder-check Marcus into lockers, sending his books scattering across the floor. During gym class, they'd accidentally hit him with basketballs or knock him down during supposedly friendly games. The teachers seemed oblivious, or perhaps they simply chose not to see what was happening right in front of them. Marcus tried different routes through the school, varying his schedule to avoid confrontations. But Riverside High wasn't that large, and Derek seemed to have an uncanny ability to find him. The worst part wasn't the physical harassment. Marcus had endured worse, but the way other students looked at him. Some showed pity, others amusement, but most just looked away, grateful it wasn't happening to them. 2 weeks into the campaign of terror, things escalated dramatically. Marcus was walking through the main hallway after school when Derek and his friends cornered him near the trophy case. The hall was mostly empty except for a few stragglers heading to after-school activities. "Going somewhere, nerd?" Derek asked, blocking Marcus's path. The older boy had clearly been working out. His muscles bulged beneath his too-tight t-shirt, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. "I need to get to my locker," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your locker can wait," Tommy interjected, stepping closer. "We want to have a little chat with you about respect." Jake circled behind Marcus, effectively trapping him against the trophy case. The glass display contained decades of athletic achievements, photographs of smiling teams and individual champions who'd brought glory to Riverside High. Marcus wondered if any of them had ever been bullied, if any of them knew what it felt like to be completely alone in a crowd. "See, here's the thing," Derek continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made him more menacing. "You've been disrespecting us for weeks now, walking away when we're talking to you, acting like you're better than us. That's not how things work around here." "I haven't done anything to you," Marcus replied, his hands instinctively moving to protect his glasses. He'd learned from experience that bullies often went for the face first. "That's exactly the problem," Derek said, his facade of friendliness dropping away. "You think you can just ignore us, but we run this school. Every scrawny little nobody like you needs to understand their place." The attack came without warning. Derek's fist crashed into Marcus's stomach, doubling him over as all the air rushed from his lungs. Before he could recover, Tommy grabbed his arms while Jake delivered a vicious kick to his ribs. Marcus gasped for breath, his vision blurring as pain shot through his torso. "This is what happens when you don't show proper respect," Derek snarled, grabbing Marcus by the hair and forcing him to look up. "Tomorrow, you're going to find us at lunch and apologize. You're going to get down on your knees in front of everyone and beg our forgiveness for being such a disrespectful little worm." Marcus tried to speak, but his diaphragm was still spasming from the gut punch. All he could manage was a weak nod, which seemed to satisfy Derek's ego. "Good," the bully said, releasing his grip, "and if you even think about running to a teacher, we'll make today look like a gentle massage." They walked away laughing, leaving Marcus crumpled against the trophy case. He stayed there for several minutes, waiting for his breathing to return to normal and his vision to clear. When he finally stood, he caught his reflection in the glass display case. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there was a small cut on his lip from where Derek's knuckles had grazed his face. That evening, Marcus sat in his room staring at the wall where his kendo equipment hung. His shinai, the bamboo practice sword, seemed to mock him from its place of honor. 10 years of training, hundreds of hours perfecting his technique, learning the ancient ways of the samurai, and for what? To cower before 3 bullies who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real dojo. His phone buzzed with a text from his father, who was working late at the accounting firm again. "How was school today, son?" the message read. Marcus stared at the screen for a long time before typing back, "Fine, just the usual." He couldn't tell his father the truth. The move to Texas had been expensive, and his parents had sacrificed a lot to give him this fresh start. His father had been so proud when Marcus promised to stay out of trouble, to use his intelligence instead of his fists to solve problems. But intelligence didn't seem to matter when faced with brute force and cruelty. The next day arrived with all the inevitability of an execution. Marcus dragged himself through his morning classes, barely able to concentrate on the lessons. His ribs still ached from yesterday's beating, and every movement reminded him of what was waiting for him at lunch. He considered skipping the meal entirely, but Derek would only track him down later, probably with even more violence. The cafeteria was packed when Marcus entered, his legs feeling like lead weights. He could see Derek and his crew at their usual table near the center of the room, holding court like medieval kings. Several other students glanced his way with expressions of morbid curiosity, clearly aware that something was about to happen. Marcus approached the table slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Derek looked up with a satisfied smirk, clearly relishing the moment. "Well, well," Derek announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look who decided to show up. Did you remember what we talked about yesterday?" The cafeteria grew quieter as more students turned to watch the spectacle. Marcus could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting to see if he would actually go through with Derek's humiliating demands. His mouth felt dry as sandpaper, and his vision seemed to narrow to a tunnel focused solely on Derek's cruel smile. Marcus started to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "What was that?" Derek cupped his ear dramatically. "I couldn't hear you. You'll need to speak up so everyone can hear your apology." Tommy and Jake flanked Derek like loyal attack dogs, their faces bright with anticipation. Other students had stopped eating to watch the show, some pulling out their phones to record what was about to happen. Marcus realized that whatever occurred next would probably be all over social media within minutes. "I said I'm sorry," Marcus managed, his voice slightly stronger but still shaking. "Sorry for what?" Derek pressed, clearly enjoying every second of Marcus's humiliation. For disrespecting you." Derek's grin widened. "That's a good start. But I don't think you're quite finished yet. Remember what I told you about getting on your knees?" The cafeteria fell completely silent now, every conversation stopping as students leaned forward to witness the complete degradation of the quiet new kid. Marcus felt something hot and acidic rise in his throat, and his hands began to tremble with a combination of fear and rage. "Come on," Derek taunted, standing up to his full intimidating height. "Everyone's waiting. Don't keep your audience in suspense." Marcus looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him. Some showed pity, others excitement, but most just displayed the blank curiosity of people watching a car accident. These were his classmates, people he saw in the halls every day, and not one of them was going to help him. Not one teacher was going to intervene. He was completely alone. Slowly, reluctantly, Marcus began to lower himself toward the floor. The linoleum felt cold and hard beneath his knees, and he could hear the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. Derek towered over him like a conquering hero, his chest puffed out with pride. "Now," Derek said in a voice dripping with satisfaction, "tell everyone what a pathetic loser you are." But before Marcus could speak, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the sight of phones recording his humiliation, or the sound of barely suppressed laughter from the crowd, or simply the overwhelming unfairness of it all. 10 years of discipline, of learning to control his temper and channel his aggression, suddenly felt like a lifetime of cowardice. Marcus started to rise, but Derek misinterpreted the movement as defiance. "Where do you think you're going?" The bully snarled, placing a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder to force him back down. That was the moment Marcus decided he'd had enough. His father's warnings about avoiding trouble, Master Takeshi's lessons about restraint, his own promises about staying out of fights, all of it crumbled in the face of Derek's overwhelming arrogance and cruelty. Marcus exploded upward, his shoulder driving into Derek's solar plexus with all the force he could muster. The bigger boy stumbled backward, genuinely surprised by the sudden resistance. For a split second, the entire cafeteria held its breath, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. "You little piece of—" Derek started to say, but Marcus was already moving. Years of kendo training had taught him that hesitation was death, that once you committed to an attack, you had to follow through completely. His first punch caught Derek square in the nose, and Marcus felt the satisfying crunch of cartilage beneath his knuckles. Blood exploded across Derek's face as he staggered backward, his hands flying up to his ruined nose. The cafeteria erupted in screams and shouts as students either fled or pressed closer to get a better view. Tommy and Jake moved to flank him, but Marcus had trained against multiple opponents before. He spun to face Tommy, his legs sweeping out in a perfect arc that sent the smaller boy crashing to the floor. Jake hesitated for just a moment, clearly unnerved by how quickly his friend had gone down, and that hesitation cost him dearly. Marcus's elbow found Jake's temple with surgical precision, dropping him beside Tommy in a heap of tangled limbs. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but the cafeteria looked like a war zone. Food trays were scattered across the floor, tables had been overturned, and 3 of the school's most feared bullies lay groaning in various states of consciousness. Derek struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his face from his broken nose. His eyes were wild with pain and rage, no longer the calculated cruelty of a bully, but the desperate fury of someone who'd just been publicly humiliated. "You're dead," he snarled through blood and snot. "You're so dead you don't even know it yet." But instead of pressing his attack, Derek did something that surprised everyone, including Marcus. He lowered his head and charged forward like an enraged bull, clearly intending to use his superior size and weight to overwhelm his smaller opponent. Marcus had seen this tactic before in tournaments. Desperate opponents often abandoned technique in favor of brute force, hoping to overpower their more skilled adversaries through sheer aggression. Master Takeshi had taught him that such attacks were actually the easiest to counter, provided you kept your composure and used your opponent's momentum against them. Derek's head connected with Marcus's chest, but instead of being bowled over, Marcus grabbed the bigger boy's shoulders and used his forward momentum to execute a perfect hip throw. Derek flew through the air and crashed into a nearby table, sending lunch trays and food flying in all directions. The impact was tremendous. Derek's head hit the edge of the table with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd killed him, but then he saw the slow rise and fall of Derek's chest and heard the wet, labored breathing that indicated he was still alive, but badly hurt. The cafeteria had gone completely silent, except for the sound of Derek's breathing and the distant wail of sirens approaching the school. Someone had called 911, and within minutes, paramedics were rushing through the doors to attend to the injured bullies. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his clothes torn and his knuckles bleeding but otherwise unharmed. He looked around at the faces of his classmates and saw something he'd never seen before. Respect. Fear, certainly, but also a grudging admiration for the quiet kid who'd finally stood up to the school's most notorious bullies. Principal Morrison, no relation to Jake, arrived with a contingent of security guards and police officers. Marcus was immediately handcuffed and led away, but not before he caught sight of Derek being loaded onto a stretcher, his face a mask of blood and bandages. The suspension hearing was held 3 days later. Marcus sat in the principal's office with his parents, facing a panel of school administrators who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Derek was still in the hospital with a severe concussion and a broken nose, while Tommy and Jake had been treated for minor injuries and released. "Mr. Yamamoto," Principal Morrison began, shuffling through a stack of papers, "what happened in the cafeteria was completely unacceptable. We have a zero-tolerance policy regarding violence, and your actions have resulted in serious injuries to 3 students. Marcus's father started to speak, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. "I understand that you have to suspend me," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that those 3 students had been bullying me for weeks. Derek forced me to get on my knees in front of the entire cafeteria and humiliate myself. I only fought back when I couldn't take it anymore." Principal Morrison nodded sympathetically but maintained his stern expression. "We've reviewed the security footage and interviewed several witnesses. While we understand that you were provoked, your response was disproportionate to the threat you faced. Derek Castellanos has a skull fracture and may have permanent brain damage." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd never intended to seriously hurt anyone, just to defend himself and escape the situation. The thought that Derek might suffer permanent consequences because of his actions made him feel sick to his stomach. "However," the principal continued, "we've also uncovered a pattern of bullying behavior from Mr. Castellanos and his associates that goes back several years. Multiple students have come forward with similar stories of harassment and intimidation. This doesn't excuse your actions, but it does provide important context." Marcus was suspended for 2 weeks and required to attend anger management counseling. Derek eventually recovered from his injuries, but the skull fracture had left him with chronic headaches and difficulty concentrating. His football career was over and his college scholarship was revoked. Tommy and Jake avoided Marcus completely, their confidence shattered by the speed and efficiency with which he'd taken them down. When Marcus returned to school, everything had changed. Students who'd never spoken to him before nodded respectfully in the hallways. The cafeteria fell silent when he entered, but it was the silence of awe rather than anticipation of violence. Teachers treated him with a mixture of wariness and respect, clearly aware that the quiet student in the corner was capable of explosive action when pushed too far. Derek never returned to school. The brain injury had affected his cognitive abilities enough that he needed specialized tutoring and therapy. Marcus heard through the grapevine that he'd moved to another district, starting over at a school where nobody knew his history as a bully or his humiliating defeat at the hands of someone half his size. The guilt ate at Marcus for months. He'd trained in martial arts to defend himself and others, not to cause permanent harm to his opponents. Master Takeshi visited him during his suspension, not to scold him for fighting, but to help him process what had happened and learn from it. "Violence should always be the last resort," the old master said, as they sat in Marcus's backyard, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. "But sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted, it becomes necessary to defend oneself. The key is knowing when you've done enough." "I didn't mean to hurt him so badly," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted him to stop." "And he did stop," Master Takeshi pointed out, "but more importantly, all the other bullies in your school saw what happened. They learned that actions have consequences, that victims can become victors if pushed far enough. You may have saved dozens of other students from experiencing what you went through." Marcus wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. He'd never wanted to be anyone's savior or example. He just wanted to be left alone to finish high school in peace. But life had other plans, and sometimes peaceful people had to make violent choices to protect themselves and others. The weeks passed, and gradually Marcus began to adjust to his new status at school. No one bothered him anymore, and he even made a few friends among students who'd been impressed by his courage in standing up to Derek. But he never forgot the lesson he'd learned that day in the cafeteria. Sometimes the price of peace is eternal vigilance, and sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to become something more dangerous than they are. Years later, when Marcus had graduated and moved on to college, he would occasionally think about Derek and wonder what had become of him. He hoped the other boy had learned something from their encounter, that maybe the brain injury had knocked some empathy into him, along with taking away his cognitive abilities. But he never regretted fighting back that day, even though the consequences had been more severe than he'd intended. The scars on his knuckles eventually faded, but the memory of that moment when he'd finally stood up for himself remained crystal clear. It was the day he'd learned that sometimes being peaceful means being prepared for war, and that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous when they finally decide they've had enough.